All right, it's June 26th, and this is your Mountain State Update. I'm John Cantees. I'm joined by Dan Hyman.
Hello.
How's it going, Dan?
It's going well. I'm a little tired. I've been running around.
Yeah, what have you've been doing some work for the New York Times?
Right. Yeah. Well, they called me up. They wanted a story about the flooding. They wanted sort of a personal story. So I went up to Clendenin and talked to a family that was up there, and they're actually there's three households, and they've all been three generations of the same sort of extended family, and they've all been flooded out. So
Right.
I talked to them, and it was kind of interesting.
I couldn't quite see on the way down the road to the station, but is the stage still underwater? Because it was.
I don't know.
It looks like it's close if it's not.
The water came down pretty quickly. It rose pretty quickly, and it went back down pretty quickly. And in fact, that was one of the things that was most interesting of the folks I talked to, is that pretty much everyone said that they felt like they had little or no warning, which I think it may be a policy issue, although I'm not sure that it's something that can be easily fixed. Because I think that this flood, I know I was listening to a lot of the weather warnings myself,
Right.
and heard a lot of the warnings on the media, beware of heavy weather. There's heavy rainfall coming, and, flood warnings and one thing and another. But apparently what happened is that a lot of people heard that, and it just they didn't realize how serious it was going to be until a neighbor knocked on their door, or they looked out and they saw, wow, the creek is overflowing its banks.
It looked like just another storm to me for
Right.
almost all of it. I didn't realize how bad it was until I started seeing things popping up on the news and on social media.
Yeah,
And
that's the same way I was.
Yeah, it was bizarre, and it's one of those things about, it's not so much the quantity of the rain, although that was a factor. It was how fast we got it all.
Right.
Well,
they say that the Elk River, which is Clendenin, where I was, reached the highest peak it's ever recorded as being,
I heard
at
that.
least since 1888.
Yeah.
So it's been it was a pretty dramatic flood, and it was fast, and it rose quickly, and it fell back down quickly. But I mean, I think I saw in USA Today, I think they were saying now that the death toll is something like 26, I think is what they're saying.
Wow.
I had heard 22, but it seems to be likely to rise. But judging from the fact that the number of people I talked to who didn't really feel like they had any warning and just barely got out, with just the clothes on their backs, we're lucky it wasn't a lot higher.
Yeah.
It really could have been a lot worse. So,
what are some solutions that you think, you did a lot of reporting on this. What are some solutions you think that we could work towards to help deal with this maybe in a more efficient way? Because we did have a lot of relief efforts. I mean, we had, Sam's Uptown Cafe and, Boulevard Tavern and us as a station, made lots of efforts. But on the, I guess I should say maybe on, on the government's level,
right.
What kind of solutions do you think?
Well, I don't know for sure. I mean, I do think that there are some issues with with surface mining, but that it tends to be a problem where folks are saying that surface mining will tend to cause flash flooding, which is not exactly the same thing. Although some of this starts to sound a bit like a flash flood when you're in a creek, a tributary of the Elk or something, and it rises suddenly. That starts to sound like a flash flood. But there is an issue there that what you want a good, strong forest ground cover so that the water doesn't run off as fast. Because we do have a lot of heavy rain. West Virginia is a very tends to be a very a place with a lot of precipitation. I mean,
Right.
I don't think we're quite a rainforest, but we're just maybe a few notches away from it. We do have a lot of rain, so you want a lot of trees to really absorb it. The other kinds of solutions, I think a lot of things that we've done, at least in the big cities, have worked pretty well. So you noticed, for example, that Haddad Park. Okay, so the amphitheater there got flooded, but it's designed in a way to be flooded. It's designed so that the water will come in and then it'll recede and it won't really cause that much damage. It's just all made out of concrete and, grass, and there's a walkway along the river there. So the Kanawha in downtown Charleston is designed so that if there's a flood, that it leaves space for the flood to go through without causing a lot of property damage.
Right.
And that's a fairly smart policy. A lot of towns in West Virginia don't really have that luxury because they're just too small and they're kind of crammed into a fairly narrow valley. And we've seen that happen a number of times. That, for example, Oceana had a bad flood. Maybe it was about 10 years ago, and the water came and it just kept rising and kept rising and kept rising because the whole town is there in that one little valley, and there just was so much water that channeled into it that it was almost impossible for it to go anywhere. I don't know. A friend of mine used to say, an environmentalist friend of mine used to say that everything in West Virginia is either on a ridge line or in a floodplain, and that's really true.
Yeah.
So I don't know what to say about that.
You got the worst of both worlds, really.
Well, I mean, there is a fair possibility that we might have to take a look at the warning system. Are we getting enough warning for folks to get out? Because that seemed to be the problem in this case. I don't know that you can really be sure to fix that, because oftentimes what will happen is you'll create this warning system and then people will become acclimated to it.
Right.
So they'll just tend to assume, okay, it's going to be just another storm like the last half dozen we've had, and it doesn't really, it's not going to be bad.
Hard to
and
strike
then it
that
turns
balance.
out to be bad. Yeah, and then it does turn out to be bad, and it's hard to fix that.
Yeah.
But that's an issue. Another issue that I think we're going to want to look at. Two brief things I'll note. One is, it looked like for a while there was a rumor going around on social media. You may have seen this, that the Summersville Dam was giving way, which would have been just a complete disaster. I mean, we probably would have had thousands of people die if that had happened. So we need to make sure that we're investing and maintaining our infrastructure, certainly in that regard.
Sure.
Especially dams. There's a lot of earthen dams in the state. There's a lot of impoundments, coal impoundments in the state.
Did that turn out to not be true?
It turned out not to be true,
Okay.
but boy, if there are some places where, like some of those coal impoundments,
Yeah.
there's one down in Raleigh County that I've written about. Boy, if that had gone, it would have been a disaster. And the other part of this, and I think it's just worth noting in passing, is that this is another example of how the state's fiscal problems are likely to be problematic for it for a long time. Because if we don't have the money for our emergency services and we don't have the money for our infrastructure, and then you have an emergency like this, then it just, it's just the state and the counties have to pay for it, and they don't have the money.
Right.
Roadways, there were a lot of roadways that were collapsed and eroded away by the storm, a lot of bridges that were blown out by the storm, and that stuff is expensive to build, and we haven't been devoting the funds to it that we should have.
Which does kind of facilitate a transition that I want to make, that we do now have a budget.
We do have a budget.
And
That's
it's kind of a combination of lots of different solutions.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting to me because I think finally, in the end, the anti-tax faction in the House blinked.
Right.
They
Which
were
had to
saying
happen. I mean, it's not...
kind of had to happen.
Yeah, I mean, there was no way around it. But I mean, really what we ended up doing was, yes, we did that. We also take a little bit from the rainy day fund.
Right.
And, lots of other things.
They swept a lot of money out of the accounts. You know, all of these agencies have leftover money from previous years, and they used all that up. There's a lot of budget analysts who are saying that, this is enough to get us through a year, but next year is probably going to be worse.
Right.
But I mean, a 65-cent a pack cigarette tax, I think is a good result. It's about the best... that's about the best tax that we could increase in this case, because it'll be good for health, but it'll also be good for the state budget.
Right.
Which is
very rarely do you see something that can do both of those.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, but we still have a tax system that's pretty much upside down. We don't really have if it had been a buck, a buck and a quarter. Then we would be approaching next year in a much better position. But there's also, I mean, our reliance on severance taxes has kind of left us in a bad spot, because the severance taxes went away and they're not coming back, at least not in the way that they had been.
So those don't come back as easily as they go away.
Well, no. I mean, what happened, it was a bad combination, because you had... coal severance taxes are based on per ton, and natural gas severance taxes are based on per dollar, in a sense. And what happened was there's been an overproduction in natural gas, so the price fell. So we're still producing a lot of natural gas, but at a lower price. Meanwhile, we're producing many fewer tons of coal, so it's almost like the worst of both worlds. I don't see that. I mean, I don't see that turning around quickly. The natural gas prices may start to bump up a little bit as the industry adjusts and reduces some of the more marginal drilling that they do. But they're going to have to keep drilling and producing. It's a complicated picture, but just in short, the natural gas companies have a lot of debt service,
right,
and they have a lot of investment in fixed costs, so they have to keep producing even if they're not making as much as they would want, even if they're producing at a loss.
Right.
Oftentimes they have to keep producing just to keep the money coming through to meet their debts.
So that, that really puts a lot of pressure on next year's budget, and it's because of the rainy day fund, really, it seems,
right?
Because that's one-time money. That money doesn't necessarily come
right.
back. And I saw that Governor Tomlin was very, he was not glowingly in favor of using this.
No, well, Tomlin. I mean, one of the things you have to understand about the rainy day fund is that that's really Tomlin's baby.
Right.
I mean, when he was, all those years that he spent as the president of the Senate, the lieutenant governor, one of the things that he had as his project was digging the state out of its, it had gotten into a bad fiscal situation with a lot of workers' comp debt and, a lot of other debts and things that they had, they hadn't paid for, and they had a lot of, unfunded liabilities. And over the years, Tomlin and people like Bob Kiss, who was the Speaker of the House, is now the Secretary of Revenue, Tax and Revenue. They dug themselves out of that pit. And there were a lot of criticisms of that. Folks like Ted Bettner had criticized them because they said, look, we're really we should be investing more in education. We should be spending more on public employees, and people like Tomlin and Kiss were really sort of green eye shade types in this, that they wanted to make the numbers add up, and they spent a long time slowly, painfully building up the the state's reserves, and so the rainy day fund is something he doesn't just want to see melt away at the first crisis. He wants that to remain, if for no other reason than because it keeps our bond rating good,
Sure.
which I'm sure that is probably the most exciting subject in the world that we could talk about.
Yeah.
But it is something that I know that he's concerned about, and so he really did not want the rainy day fund to be rated.
So anyway, so that does put a lot of pressure on next year, and we'll just have
Right.
to wait and see.
We'll have to see.
We'll have to see, because then anytime you use funds like that, you are in some way kicking the can down the road.
Right, and I do think that some of this, and this is a thing that Ted Bettner and folks like Sean O'Leary at the Center on Budget and Policy have pointed out, and I think they're dead right, is that a lot of the state's budgetary issues have come from a repeal of a lot of business taxes. Also, the repeal of the food tax. I think the repeal of the food tax was more justifiable because that's really one that hits poor people hard.
Right.
But there was the repeal of business and occupation taxes has just gone away, and that increased our reliance on severance taxes because we were thinking that these natural gas severance taxes were going to go on forever, and lo and behold, they didn't.
So let's move on from one
Yes.
disaster to the next. Brexit.
Well, we'll see if it's a disaster or not. I mean, the Dow certainly took a beating, and the other markets, the FTSE and the CAC, and
Well, the pound is down to 1985 levels right now.
is it really that
Yes.
bad?
Yes.
I know it had been one of the steepest drop. Nobody really knows. I mean, the Remain camp was kind of saying that this is going to be bad. And
Well-
I tend to believe them. I mean, we'll find out how bad it is now.
What I don't understand is I've done a lot of reading on this,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't seem to understand the rationale for leaving. I don't. What is to be gained? I realize we've heard a lot about the problems of leaving,
Right.
And I'm honestly looking for concrete reasons why
Well,
they wanted to leave.
there's a couple of things going on here. One is a kind of an emotional reason,
Right.
and one is a kind of I think a legitimate criticism of the European Union. One criticism of it is that it's an undemocratic organization, that they have these members of the European Parliament who are elected officials. And they are, accountable to their constituents, but they don't have a lot of power. That a lot of the power in the European Union is vested in these unelected institutions where the leadership is not elected; it's appointed or somehow, and in the bureaucracy. And there's a lot of criticism. This was a criticism from the left for a long time, that the EU was an undemocratic institution. Now, I think that could be fixed. I don't think that's a terminal problem. The
That
real
doesn't seem like one to me.
No,
Or the other complaint where there's just so much bureaucracy that it's so
Right.
hard to. I mean, you have there's so many regulations on pillows. I
yeah,
saw
well,
stuff
some
about
of some of that has been artificially, I think, inflated.
Sure.
I think some of that's been kind of ginned up in a way that's
John Oliver
inaccurate.
does a real good job
John
with that.
Oliver's, as usual, is really a brilliant critique of that.
Right.
He pointed out that what is there's been these criticisms of these pillow regulations, and one of them was it was like a food that looks like a pillow or
Right.
something.
They
like
just
that.
wanted
It's
little paragraphs to make it
Yeah.
look like a lot. No,
Yeah.
the thing is, it comes from a place where there's sort of something to gripe about here.
There is a criticism that, and this is one that I've made before, that the European Union and the European Common Market and the European institutions tend to be very inertial. They're very hard to get them moving. So,
Right.
for example, when the U.S. wanted action on the the war in the former Yugoslavia. It was really hard to get the Europeans off the dime because they were trying to operate by consensus, and it was very difficult to get everyone to agree to a consensus. So there's an awful lot of dithering by the Europeans, and that's something that's bad. But again, I think that's stuff that is not impossible to fix. I think the real impetus, though, for the Brexit and for the objection to the European Union, and this is what you're seeing on the right, this is kind of the right's critique of the European Union, is the free movement of people.
Yeah.
And even though, there was a sort of a quasi-racist, I think, argument that the UKIP people, the UK Independence Party people made, and in fact there was a poster that showed sort of these lines of Syrian refugees, as a picture of these lines, and it looked like this sort of invading army that they're going to come in and take away our English roast beef or whatever.
Right.
And it's some of that is very. I think there's an undercurrent of race to that, in part because that would be a problem. The refugees would be a problem, whether or not you had a European Union or not. I mean, those people would still be coming. They'd still be trying to cross the English Channel,
regardless of how what the problems are with the messaging of that gripe. I mean,
right.
It's that you're not fixing it by doing this.
But this is the comparison people have made to Trump is that they feel like the right wing critics of the European Union are looking to this kind of hazy, nostalgic vision of English, power and glory and tradition, and they want to take their country back. Well, it ain't gonna happen, for one thing. England is a multicultural society, and a lot of people, as has been pointed out by others smarter than me, England after the end of World War II, the empire really collapsed, and they lost India and they lost the colonial possessions, and they went through a long period of very painful adjustment to no longer being,
they had the whole world just about.
Yeah, well, the sun never set on the English Empire, right? It's the classic line. They lost that, and it was a very painful process for them. But over decades, they got past that. They became a modern, multicultural, very sophisticated, very rapidly moving. A lot of companies in England that are perfectly capable of competing with anyone in the world.
Sure.
And they really turned it into a modern sort of high-tech economy. And that's, that change is A, good, and B, if they want to go back to the traditional English empire of, white people telling brown people what to do, it's not going to happen.
Right.
Those days are over. They're never coming back. But there's definitely an undercurrent of that especially you sort of divide up take a look by age of who voted in the Brexit. It was the older and more nostalgic voters who voted for leaving, and it was the younger and more sort of optimistic and much more, people who are much more comfortable with diversity who voted to stay.
Now, right after this happened, Trump gave a speech in Scotland, I believe.
Yeah,
and I don't know. There's lots of people drawing connections between the success of Brexit and Trump, and I don't know if one can necessarily feed into the other. But because obviously people in the UK aren't going to be voting for the American election, but is there some sort of psychological impact that you see here? Is there some sort of
That's a very good question. I mean,
isolationist being legitimized in a way?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely this same emotional appeal to taking our country back, sort of get rid of the invaders,
making the UK great again.
Making the UK great again. There's a similarity there. I do think Trump's version of that is a lot more. Well, there are a lot of differences. And I'm not really sophisticated enough to explain them. But there's a lot of differences between Great British politics and American politics.
Sure.
But
on an emotional level, though, on the surface,
the emotional level there's definitely a comparison, and it's definitely a similar voting bloc to whom he's appealing. I don't think. Will he get a boost from this? I'm hard pressed to say. I did think there was one interesting thing that I saw on social media, which I thought was pretty funny. There's apparently a lot of people who object to that golf course he was going to open in Scotland, and I just thought it was kind of weird that this guy is, he's leaving his political campaign to go open a frickin' golf course. I mean, get your priorities straight. But
he may have his priorities straight. Yeah, we just might not know what they are.
Might not. Yeah. Well, he has his Donald Trump priorities. So
right.
But apparently there were people who hate his golf course and hate him. So what they've been doing is they were planting Mexican flags all around his golf course. People were flying Mexican flags.
Yeah, I didn't see
as a
that.
form of protest. Okay. Yeah. Well, leave it to the Scots.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was talking about how everybody was celebrating in Scotland in the exit when in fact Scotland voted nearly 2-1 to remain. And that's a possibility that a lot of people are talking about now. Is you're going to start to see pressure for Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland to leave Great Britain, leave the UK. And like Northern Ireland would rejoin Ireland, and it would be part of the EU, and Scotland would become a separate country, and it would probably rejoin the EU. I don't know. I don't think Wales. I don't think there's enough of an
outcry.
Yeah, there's not enough of a cry for an independent Wales to really make that difference. But who knows? It's possible.
No, those are our political implications, but as far as economic implications for America, now that seems...
This is the part that bothers me.
Right.
Because it is... A lot of people are thinking that this is going to have a negative impact on economic growth. Certainly, we trade a great deal with...
We're going to have to renegotiate our trade deals with the UK, are we not?
Yeah, and the president was actually sort of threatening the English leave camp by saying that that's not going to happen automatically, that there's not going to be it's not going to be easy to do that. Anytime you get sort of a crimp in free trade all of a sudden imposed, that it does tend to slow down economic growth.
Right.
The part that bothers me is that in the near term, if the growth slows down, I'm not sure that the central banks really have room to necessarily address that. I mean, the Fed has still got they bumped up the short-term interest rates by 0.25% or something from the very bottom, but they're still very, very low. And if we start to have an economy, if things start to slow down here, they don't have a lot of room to maneuver. And we could see more fiscal policy to address that, increased spending by Congress and, deficit spending by the federal government. But Congress is definitely not in the mood to do that. Certainly not, controlled by somebody like Paul Ryan.
Sure.
Would not be in favor of more deficit spending, even though the sound economic wisdom would suggest that would be wise.
Sure. And they're going to have to do this all across the board.
Yeah,
with everybody.
And I mean, it's also sort of curious. I don't know necessarily. The European Central Bank. I don't know how much room they've got to work, and I don't know. I mean, there's also sort of concerns about growth in China, whether that's going to be slowing down, and the central bank in England. Now they have said that they were prepared for this, that they've been, writing contingency plans, and that they have plenty of liquidity, and that they've tested their banks and everything. So they may be able to adapt, and it may not be as bad an economic shock as I'm afraid. But if it is a bad economic shock, I'm not sure that we really have the tools handy to really deal with it.
Right, because damage is done so much easier than solutions.
Yeah. I mean,
this
we
type of thing.
really just sort of have really been crawling out of the recession, the Great Recession, and the economic slowdown that resulted from it. We finally we're starting to get some wage growth. We're starting to get but inflation is still low, very low. It's still very slow, painful growth. So we'll see.
It's incremental.
So
now we had this is an issue that I'm interested in that has been developing in a very interesting way. This sit-in in the House.
Yeah.
The Democrats have decided to, the sit-in's over now, but they said they were there overnight. I'm not sure if it went much longer than that. I think 36 hours is what they got to.
Yeah.
And
which is actually, I think, it's a long time considering Congress.
And it was interesting how the C-SPAN shut off their cameras, because that's when they normally shut it off.
Right.
So what happened was Democrats that were sitting in the House, this is over gun reform, by the way, if anyone hasn't heard of this or is familiar with what happened here. But they wanted to initiate some sort of talk of gun reform. And or at least, background checks and stuff like that.
They were trying to force the House to vote on some gun reform measures, which the Speaker had just been absolutely refusing to bring up. And refusing to let them debate, let them vote on it. So he was they were trying to force his hand there.
Which is an interesting thing, because they did this last time, that there was a big push for this. They just said no, all across the board.
Right.
But at least I think it came to a vote after Sandy Hook, did it not?
You may know more about this.
I think
than
it did.
I do.
But regardless, the point is, why not come to a vote? Like, if they have the numbers, what's the problem?
Well, basically, the problem is that gun control is popular with the public and not with the Republican base, and not with Republicans who are badly dependent on NRA money. So that's the problem. Is that they have to answer to the NRA bosses, and the NRA bosses are not terribly popular with the broad reach of the American public. I mean, I think some of these gun control measures are really, pretty moderate gun control measures that are popular with 70% of the American people, 80% in some cases. The idea that no fly, no buy, that if you're on the terrorist watch list, you can't get a gun.
I mean, why not?
That's hugely popular.
Isn't this something that, if your voters, if your base is not in favor of something like this, you're the leader, you're the representative. You make your case to those people and maybe change their minds. Isn't that what old-fashioned politicking used to be?
Well,
you don't necessarily, you're there to do the bidding of your voters, but you're also there to lead.
There is an argument that you just vote what your constituency wants. There's a division between politicians who say, I vote my conscience, I vote my, what I think is right and what I think is smart. And then there are others who say, I was elected by a group of people and I'm there to represent their interests. Either way, I think that's kind of beside the point, because the real power here is the power that's being exercised over the Republican caucus in the House is by a real faction, a very conservative faction that says if you threaten gun control, threaten to bring about gun control in any way, even talk about it, you're going to pay a price. You're going to face a primary opponent. Somebody like Joe Manchin, who is really a longtime hunter. Has a long time used to have a very good rating from the NRA. He can't even talk about a very moderate kind of close a loophole gun show loophole piece of legislation without paying a price for it from the NRA. They really will make him, that'll sting.
And let's acknowledge why the NRA doesn't like that. Because it means less gun sales. That's what it means.
Yeah.
I mean, when you refuse people on the terrorist watch list, or I guess in this case, people who were on it within 5 years, I think is what the border that they set, and you've refused them gun sales, the gun industry, people that support the NRA, are going to get less money.
Well, at some point, it starts to be a battle of symbolism. And I think this is the criticism that Republicans made of the sit-in, is that it was just theatrical, symbolism.
Well, that's what political protest is supposed to be.
Politics, that's a big part of what politics is symbolism.
Sure.
I mean, they knew that the legislation, even if it got a vote in the House, was going to be voted down. Even if it got past the House, it had already failed in the Senate. So it wasn't like this was a real issue, but they're trying to push the point that eventually this has got to happen because the people want it to happen. Now you're starting to see some level of agitation on the part of the gun control side among the public.
Sure.
The gun control advocates are going to have to get out there. They're going to have to make donations. They're going to have to vote. They're going to have to be organized. And this is where the NRA has been really successful, where the NRA and the gun control opponents have been really successful. They really exercise their political power to within an inch of its life. I mean, they're absolutely opposed to any kind of controls.
Right.
Just on the basis that it's an absolute, anything is an infringement of the Second Amendment, and so they make
Everything
that
is
argument.
leading to guns being confiscated.
That's right. Yeah. Well, they make that argument. You're going to have to get that kind of devotion and activism and, dare I say it, fanaticism on the part of the gun control advocates if you're going to defeat that.
Well, I mean, if you're sitting, say you have no opinion on this, and you're completely uninformed, and you're just a low-information citizen on this particular issue, and you see Democrats pushing for, okay, let's keep people who are on terrorist watch lists away from guns.
Right.
That's what they're asking for. That's what they've said.
Right.
And then you see Republicans saying, you're not going to take my guns away.
Right.
What would you think? Wouldn't you realize something's fishy here?
Well, there's definitely, that particular piece of legislation, well, it's why they chose that place to make their fight.
Right.
I don't think that's a particularly good piece of legislation. I think there are much smarter pieces of legislation.
Well, there's a process in place if you want to challenge it, too. I mean, there's due process.
Sure. But it's extremely popular. So they're getting to the point where, using a sit-in tactic, that's John Lewis, the civil rights leaders, in Congress, led this sit-in. This is a kind of mass movement kind of technique. This is speaking to that point that they want to get a bulk of Americans who are in favor of this stuff to get up and force some kind of action. I mean, part of this has to do with the election. They really want to, as the English say, wrong foot the Republicans on this issue going into November.
Well, and Hillary Clinton may have. I thought she was just looking for the one or two things that she differed with Bernie Sanders on, and was just going to capitalize on that. But really, she may have seen this coming, this type of issue coming, and just gotten on the right side of it right off the bat. Or maybe both, I don't know.
Yeah,
but it's going to work very well.
I think
very
it
well
will
for
work
Hillary
well
Clinton.
for her. I do think that she has been, and she's got a lot of credibility on this issue.
Sure.
And she can look at, a lot of these like sort of mothers for gun control, and every town, what is it, Bloomberg's organization, every town gun control, they are. Those positions are popular, and she has those positions that she's taken these positions for a long time, and,
Right.
So I think it will work for her.
And she hasn't been on, at least to my recollection, I don't think she's really been on the other side of this, except for, maybe.
Not as far as I know. Certainly in a very modest kind of way. I mean, this is a sort of a. I do think there's a big gender split here. And this just sort of speaks to this, this gender gap that the electorate is moving towards. That men, the NRA, the gun voters. I mean, there are certainly women members of the NRA.
Sure.
But they're definitely strongly skewed male. Those positions are strongly skewed male, whereas the notion of safety, we need to protect our children, we need to protect our neighborhoods, that's a very kind of a feminist sort of a natural kind of a feminist position.
Sure.
I don't want to, go too heavily into that, because you start to get into a sort of a gender cliche, a gender stereotype there. But I do think that it's easy for somebody like Clinton to say, hey, I'm a grandma, I don't want the streets full of AK-47s.
Right.
Or AR-15s.
It fits that caricature, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Which, that can only help. But the thing is that this is something that she fought with Bernie on.
Yep.
And, I don't know if it's going to play, I don't know if it's going to be a big deal when you're talking about the Democratic platform, because really the one thing that they differed on was not a huge deal. It's really kind of splitting hairs. When you get down to what the actual thing that they disagreed on was manufacturers, should they be responsible?
Right.
And I don't think people on either side of that are particularly
well. I
passionate
think that what you had very definitely in the Democratic primary was a very different kind of fight than you're going to see. I mean, I did think it was interesting that you started to get Hillary really taking the gloves off with Trump,
right?
In the last couple of weeks, and Trump is already. I mean, I don't know if he ever had the gloves, and maybe he couldn't find any small enough to fit. But had to make the joke.
Just hanging over his fingers.
Yeah, just anyway,
Bizarre.
just flapping there loosely. He's always been sort of. Just as fits his style, is just he never holds anything back. But definitely Clinton had been reserved, and I think to a degree, oftentimes, at least during most of the primary, towards the end, it got a little rougher.
He had a very bad
Senator
week.
Sanders. Yeah, I mean,
Trump
but
did.
Senator Sanders was pulling his punches. I think Hillary was pulling her punches.
Sure.
But now we're seeing that it's, the gloves are off.
Right. And come the convention, I think we're going to see the consolidation of the left. And
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I definitely think so. I mean, I'm still seeing some indication of, some people are bidding for some of the Sanders voters to go to Jill Stein, who's the Green Party candidate.
Not gonna
I
happen.
don't think it's going to happen.
I mean, it's in small amounts,
small
sure.
numbers.
People that probably
People who
weren't
probably
gonna-
wouldn't vote anyway.
Right. A lot of independents,
Yeah.
who probably aren't registered Democrat anyway, and they were going to vote for Jill Stein anyway, will probably do that. But that's not going to be a major
Well,
player.
one thing that I think is going to be interesting, and you probably will see this is actually sort of a smart bit of strategic voting, is that people, Democratic Party organizations and Democratic activists are going to say, if you're not in a swing state, right?
Right.
Like here in West Virginia, we know how our election's going to go.
More likely.
Trump's going to win this state.
He's about 20 points ahead right now.
Yeah, and so it really doesn't matter if somebody in West Virginia votes for the Libertarian, what's his name, Johnson or Jill Stein,
Right.
Gary just
Johnson.
as a protest vote, or in trying to get Johnson an opportunity to be on the ballot next time or be in the debates. It's that's something that the Democratic Party is probably fine with. Of course, they want those votes for down ballot. But if you show up and you vote, make a protest vote at the presidential level in a state like West Virginia, it isn't going to matter. Texas. I've heard from some people in Texas who say that there's no way no way in hell Hillary's going to win Texas, so it doesn't really matter if they make a protest vote.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I feel. If you're super Bernie or bust, if you're one of these people, then I would say
unless you're in a swing state, unless you're in Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Virginia, Iowa, Colorado. A place where the polls are really close. Then
if you're within 5 points,
yeah,
I would say do the responsible thing. But whatever. It is up to you at the end of the day.
That's right.
I don't want to get into the business of telling people how to vote. But we are going to have to leave it there. We're getting close to the top of the hour here, and we have the Downtown Rundown coming up shortly. And I just want to thank Dan Hyman for coming in today.
Sure.
And we'll be back next week. Also, be sure you can check us out on Twitter. Tweet us, tell us we're dumb. Tell us if you want us to talk about something else next week. Also, I posted on the Twitter a link to our YouTube channel where you can go.
There we go.
And you can
That's
watch.
Something I want to.
Yeah, you can catch up on our older episodes. I have the one from week before last, before I got sick, where we had Robert Hattie on, and we talked about some interesting stuff.
Okay, that's good.
So that'll be up.
And you can find my stories. I got a story about the flood coming up at publicnewsservice.org. You can find that.
Sure. So we'll be back next
week. Or on
week.
the New York Times. You'll find me in the New York Times.
Sure, yeah. You're a New York Times correspondent.
I hope.
But so we will.
My editors don't bail on me or decide that I'm a complete incompetent or something.
Well, we'll see.
Always possible.
We'll always have you here, though. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
But so we'll be back next week, Sunday at noon on WTSQ 88.1 in Charleston.